I guess the most profound insight of ecology is that it's a science that focuses on relationships, on how organisms and communities interact with each other and with their physical environments, how these communities are dynamic, not static, and how interactions are happening all the time, how living things are adapting, competing, and yes, even cooperating, how they're shaping their environment and how they're also being shaped by it. And also, and crucially, how humans are but one species within the ecological community, albeit a species with an outsized footprint. This perspective informed a lot of the creative choices and decisions that I made while I was composing my next book, a group of short stories that JD referenced. It's called Right of Way. All of these stories it came out last fall, and I believe it's on sale in the lobby over here, by the way. All of these stories are set in the same neighborhood. It's a gentrifying neighborhood inside the Capital Beltway that is not at all unlike Alexandria's Delray community, where I've been living for the past 11 years and hanging out for a few years longer than that. The title of the book implies this ecological perspective in a couple of ways. First of all, the concept of right-of-way and who has it is a concept that's always in play in a gentrifying neighborhood where you have families who've been there for several generations. In the case of this neighborhood, some of the more recent generations have experienced some pretty bad blight. And new families are coming in, often with big plans for how they're going to change not only the old rundown house that they bought, but the whole neighborhood. And so right-of-way and who has it is being negotiated all the time in the stories that I'm telling in this book. Second, one of the principal features of this neighborhood, I call it Cleve Springs, is a feature that I borrowed pretty much intact from Delray. It's an old railroad right-of-way that cuts through the neighborhood and plays a variety of roles in the neighborhood ecology. I wanted to have this railroad thing partially because of the history. Delray and Cleve Springs that's based on it is a railroad neighborhood built by people who were working in Potomac Yards, which was a huge and very active rail yard that started to close down in the 60s and finally shut, I think, in the late 80s. And the neighborhood sort of rose and fell with the fortunes of the rail yard. But I was also really interested in that space, that old railroad right-of-way that no longer carries trains. It's owned by the city, and it's green space now. Part of it is a playground for kids. Part of it is a dog exercise area. It functions as a bicycle corridor, and also as a refuge. And in one of the stories, it's a refuge for a furtive teenage kid who doesn't want adults knowing what he's up to. And also for an opportunistic organism that's in search of a new habitat. So what I'd like to do, if you will indulge me, is read to you an excerpt from one of the stories. It's the title story. It's called Right-of-Way. And it explores this part of the right-of-way, that this refuge part that I referenced before. I'm going to read you basically the last passage. So there's quite a bit of setup that I have to do, so bear with me for a second. The main characters in this story are a couple, a youngish couple. They're recent transplants from the Bay Area. His name is Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, and hers is Nita, which is short for manzanita, a plant that's native to the region where she was raised out in Northern California. Wright is an architect who's come to work in a DC firm. Nita is pregnant with their first child. The other main character is a teenage boy named Ash. He lives next door to Wright and Nita's place in a very rundown old apartment building with his mother, who is a junkie, who never leaves the house, and her boyfriend, who's a drunk. Ash is basically a self-raised boy. He's not very up on his hygiene. He's dirty, a little stinky, not a great communicator. But Ash and Nita have a little connection. She hired him to help do some odd jobs for her, and she feels a certain kind of curiosity about him and responsibility for him. She often watches him after he gets off the school bus, there's a part of this right-of-way that's been gated and fenced off because it goes through the backs of a number of people's backyards. And when the neighborhood got really bad, they got the city to put up this fence. But Ash knows that if you pull that gate as hard as you can, there's enough space to wriggle through, and so you can get back there. And that's sort of his domain. She watches him go back there after school a lot of days and then gets curious. So one night she and Wright walk down to the right-of-way fence to have a look around one evening. While they're standing there, Wright starts holding forth about his vision of a more connected neighborhood where the fence goes away and the bike path that runs the length of the entire right-of-way continues on to the highway. Meanwhile, while he's talking, Nita sees Ash standing on the other side of the fence, and he's holding a jug of milk. She soon learns that cats are starting to go missing from the homes occupied by families who live along that fenced-off section of the right-of-way. And she has a pretty strong suspicion that Ash must be involved. So the passage that I'm going to read is the very last part of the story. Here, Nita has to slip through that gate herself, and she's probably about 6 months, 7 months pregnant at this point. She has to slip through that gap in the gate herself because she's out looking for a friend's cat. The cat's name is Athena. The cat's escaped the house, and the friend can't go after her because she's got a little child that she has to look after. So I'm going to pick this up just as she gets through the gate. The world beyond the fence was unlike any place she'd ever experienced. Struggle and strife were everywhere, with grasses and bushes and vines and trees all vying for limited sunlight and space. A well-worn path led her into this riot of growth, then branched and kept branching until she couldn't tell the side paths from the main stem and had a hard time keeping track of her general direction. Some of the shrubs and trees and grasses she saw were natives, no doubt, old residents reclaiming habitat wrested away by people long before. But Nita was a stranger here, an exotic herself, with no way of knowing which plants had historic claims and which were invaders. She did recognize some of what she saw, trumpet creepers and wisteria and honeysuckle vines that had escaped from backyards and claimed sections of the right-of-way. Clumps of daylilies grew in a few spots, the last of their orange blossoms spread to the sun. Here and there, the frenzy of warring plants was interrupted by a square of managed ground where vegetables grew in neat rows, by a swing set and sandbox, even a tiny pond edged with river rocks. People have kind of incorporated parts of this into their backyards. In 2 spots, she discovered falling down wooden forts whose makers had moved on to other forms of play. As she followed the winding paths, the ring of Hannah's panicked voice diminished in her ears, and the image of calico Athena receded to the back of her mind. This feral space consumed her attention and occupied her senses. Shapes and colors clashed, light shifted, scents collided. She wandered. Yet as she wandered, dodging thorny briars, ducking vines, veering onto path after winding path, she sensed she was somehow progressing. So she was not exactly surprised when she reached the edge of a bright clearing and saw, across the heads of the tall grasses that grew there, the crisp profile of pointed ear and snout. Except for that ear and snout and the bushy black tip of the tail, the animal was hidden in the grass. But she knew a coyote when she saw one. It stood no more than 20 yards from her, eyes and ears pointed forward, so locked in on the object of their attention that the coyote was oblivious to Anita's arrival. Nita shifted her gaze right, following the coyote's line of sight until her own eyes came to rest on Athena. The cat crouched on the far side of the clearing, lapping hungrily at one of several silver bowls. One word from Nita, a sudden movement, would have saved the cat. But Athena was not the one she had come here to protect. Drunk on free milk, her instincts dulled by too many nights in the bungalow, Athena never even sensed the attack coming. A short yowl of surprise, a scream of panic, and she was silent. The coyote carried the dead cat by the throat, trotting light-footed back across the clearing until a breeze came up and advertised Nita's presence. The coyote stopped, glanced right at Nita, fixing her with a pair of sober, appraising eyes, then turned and bounded off into the high grass. "Ash," Nita said loudly, "are you here?" She looked all around the clearing. "Come out." A jay shrieked behind her. She pulled out her water bottle and took a long drink, her eyes on the clearing. The boy emerged from the mouth of a little trail to her left. "Where does it take the cats?" she said. He led her across the clearing toward where the coyote had disappeared. Soon they were deep into the right-of-way's network of paths, Ash guiding her swiftly from path to path, proprietary, confident, a master of this strange geography. Walls of vegetation cut off the view to either side, but she began to hear traffic up ahead. Eventually they emerged at the top of a steep, grassy embankment, at the edge of which stood a metal fence. The highway was just across the fence. Beyond the highway stretched a swath of open land, site of the long-defunct rail yard, where, Wright had told her, every man in Cleve Springs once worked. Construction crews had recently broken ground for the vast box mall that would fill that acreage. Ash pointed down to the bottom of the embankment, toward the dark round opening of a culvert. She goes through that pipe to get across the highway. After that, she sneaks across that whole big job site. Her den is by the river. She's got 7 pups. Nita never suspected Ash could string so many words together. "How do you know?" "I followed her. A few times." The smell rising from the culvert, all too familiar, quelled any doubts she might have about this claim. "How'd a coyote get here?" He grinned. "I mean, I thought they only lived out west." "Jesus," she marveled, a classroom map of North America unfurling before her mind's eye, scores of blue waterways spilling to either side of the continental divide and webbing the continent's body like veins. The muscular Rockies ran from top to bottom, cleanly dividing west and east. The whole picture seemed temporary now, negotiable. What's that about? "Wolves lived here before people killed them off. A teacher said that." The boy had actually learned something in school? The possibility had never occurred to her. "So," she said, "there was an opening?" They turned together, but she wasn't ready to start back. "Ash, did you buy milk with the money Wright and I paid you?" "And bowls." "Why do you do it?" she said. "Why do you help her catch the cats?" "Not for her." "Oh," Nita said, "for the pups." It pleased him, she saw, that he didn't have to spell this out to her. He pointed towards her belly. "Got a name yet?" "It's funny, Ash. I have this feeling that when I see the child, I'll know." "Manzanita," he said. "A wild queen of a plant, my dad always told me. Beautiful and tough." He lingered, kicking at the ground. "Ash is such an interesting name," she said. "Do you know how your parents chose it?" "I didn't know ash was a kind of tree until Wright said it. I went home and asked my mom if that's where my dad and her got my name." He looked over toward the culvert. "What did she say?" She couldn't remember. "Oh, Ash." Nita stepped up and embraced the boy. She breathed in his atmosphere, stewing in the fearful odors of neglect, as both her hands clasped tightly on his ribby back. Before they headed for home, Nita explained what was going to happen next. The police would come to question him about the disappearing cats, and he would swear he knew nothing about it. He would stay out of the right-of-way for at least the next 2 months. He would tell no one about the coyote, and she would also keep quiet about that. Together, they would figure out a safer way to keep the pups from going hungry. They were quiet as he led her back through the bushy labyrinth, across the same ground where on nice days, a few years deeper in, she would ride her bike along a sinuous asphalt path through expanses of clipped green lawn, her little girls chattering in the trailer behind the bike, their names as much a part of them as the whorled patterns on their fingertips. Even then, her own house transformed into 2 stories of grace and light, the apartment house next door renovated and rented out to tenants of a different kind. Nita would never travel this section of the right-of-way without stopping briefly to free the girls from the trailer and lead them in a chorus of howls. Thanks a lot.